Hey, welcome to week 12, where we're going to talk a little bit more about westward expansion and then war with Mexico. So this is a painting you're all familiar with. You discussed it last week. You all did a great job. You noticed several things. You noticed this woman here. Some of you noticed that she was carrying telegraph wire with her, bringing technology and super whiteness over to the western United States. See, all the white people are headed that way. All the technologies are headed that way. There's ships in the background. The image is kind of blurry, so this one's not good. But you can see it's dark, scary over on this side. Wild animals are fleeing. Native Americans are fleeing. Then over here, all the light and everything is just kind of moving west. And so this was supposed to be an inspirational painting. Some of you think it's still inspirational and you like it, and that's great. Many of you don't like it. You thought that, it was more of a propaganda painting. Either way you feel about it is fine. But we start seeing with Manifest Destiny, once the Native Americans start being removed from the United States, then, and we talked about this last week briefly, then the United States looks to Mexico to finish the westward expansion. So we start seeing heavy racism towards Mexicans. And if you haven't done your reading yet, you will notice that, that's a popular trend. We start seeing a lot of people condemning Mexico sort of as a way to justify pushing in there. All right, so here's Mexico. And you can see it includes a lot of land that does end up being the United States. Okay, so Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821. And so they were, the independent country of Mexico. 1833 is when Catholic Church land holdings, so the missions in California, were given to Mexican cattle ranchers. And so we have these rancheros in California in particular that have they're like estate rulers similar to the slaveholders of the Old South. So they were using native slave labor, and the enslaved population in Mexico, which consisted of the native Mexicans, their mortality rate was like double that of the southern enslaved people. So that was a rough life for them for sure. So after Mexico got its independence in 1821, they started trading with the United States. Prior to that, when it was Spanish land, they were not trading with foreign nations. So that opened up in 1821. And then very quickly, we start seeing fighting over Texas. And Texas looks like this at the time. A little different than we know it. Okay. So we do have the Texas Rebellion. So early on in independence, Mexico had encouraged U.S. settlement of the state of Texas. So right in here. And we have these impresarios. These are American land agents who go back and forth. They get permission from Mexican authorities to settle U.S. families in Texas. And so like 90% of these, U.S. citizens that are moving into Texas, which again is a Mexican state, 90% of them are from the South. And so they're bringing enslaved workers and cotton with them into Texas. There are a lot of tensions at this time because the rules of the Mexican state is different than what's going on in the United States. So for one, Mexico prohibited Protestant churches. And if 90% of people are coming from the South, that's going to be a big problem because folks in that area are heavily Protestant. In 1829, Mexico abolished slavery. So again, if 90% of people are coming from the South, that's going to be a problem. And in the 1830s, Mexico passed laws prohibiting new immigration into Mexico. So between 1830 and 33, we just have tons of illegal American immigrants and their enslaved workers flooding into Texas, which doubled the colonial population in that area. Again, a flood of illegal American immigrants into Mexico. Just want to make that clear. And that ended up being repealed in 1833, the prohibition on new immigration, because it was just causing a lot of problems diplomatically, but it also was ineffective because Americans continued just to migrate there anyway. So the American population in Texas outnumbered Texans of Hispanic descent by like 10 times. They were just really moving into Texas in huge numbers. 1834, President Santa Anna and Congress took power away from the states and concentrated it federally at Mexico City. And Texas had wanted the opposite. They had wanted more states' rights, which again is a pretty big theme in the South. Wanted more states' rights and less concentrated federal power. So there are uprisings across Mexico protesting this, also protesting taxes. And so these uprisings caused Santa Anna to march north with an army. And a rebel Mexican militia drove back the first party, captured Mexican troops in San Antonio. So there was a bit of resistance, a little bit of civil war going on inside of Mexico. Okay, moving right along. We have the creation of Texas as a republic. So March 2nd, 1836, a provisional government proclaimed Texas independence. So 1836. And it was signed by several prominent Tejanos, so Mexican Texans. Constitution was similar to the U.S. Constitution, but it prohibited Texas's Congress from interfering with slavery. While that was going on, like the exact same time, Santa Anna attacked the Alamo, killing all of the defenders. So there are 187 defenders of the Alamo, and Santa Anna and his troops just took them all out. It was a costly victory because he ended up losing about 1,500 men. But this is, that famous Battle of the Alamo. A few days later, Sam Houston led the surprise attack with several U.S. volunteer militia on the Mexican army. And this is allegedly where he shouted, "Remember the Alamo." This was a very quick battle because it was, a massive surprise. It was about a 15-minute battle, and he won. He captured Santa Anna, threatened to execute him, and said, if you don't sign these treaties, we're going to execute you. The treaties recognized Texas independence, and it ordered Mexican troops south of the Rio Grande. That's an important feature because later Texas claimed that meant Santa Anna was recognizing the Rio Grande as the boundary, but we'll get to that in a minute. So this was repudiated by Mexico. It was not considered an official treaty because it was done, under duress, and it wasn't, like the whole government wasn't signing it, just one person. All right, so Sam Houston, because of this massive victory, becomes president of Texas in 1836. He wanted Texas to become a part of the United States, but Andrew Jackson, who was nearing the end of his presidency, did not want to do that because it could hurt Van Buren's chances in the 1836 election. So on the last day in office, Jackson recognized the fact that Texas was independent, but that's all he did. Van Buren never dealt with the Texas issue during his term, and it wasn't until Tyler's last day in office in 1845 that Texas was annexed as a slave state. So it took almost 10 years. Okay, so more trouble with Mexico. So for one, we have that treaty that was signed. And let's look at a map. Let's go back and look at a map here. Okay, so when Santa Anna signed that treaty, he signed it saying he would send his troops south of the Rio Grande. So he's going to take his troops, and they're all going to go this way. As you can see, though, the border of Texas is along the Nueces River. And so the United States was now claiming that since Santa Anna signed the treaty moving his troops south of the Rio Grande, that meant he was acknowledging that this was the border of Texas, which, you know, he clearly didn't sign saying that. It's just being interpreted that way. Okay. So, again, Mexico never formally recognized that treaty. They never formally recognized the fact that Texas was independent, and we have that border dispute, whether or not it's the Rio Grande or the Nueces. So, when Texas was annexed, Mexico cut off diplomatic ties with the United States. Again, because they had never formally recognized independence, so the way they see it, the United States is just taking Texas. And so President Polk ends up sending troops to Texas to kind of instigate things a little bit. He had tried to pay Mexico for this disputed territory, but Mexico overwhelmingly did not want to give any more land away to these land-hungry Americans. So instead, Polk sent 4,000 troops down to the Rio Grande in that disputed territory to instigate war. And meanwhile, Polk and his cabinet were working on persuading Congress to declare war on Mexico, but they didn't really have a good reason until after hearing that Mexican forces had crossed the Rio Grande and killed 11 Americans. And then they were able to blame Mexico for the entirety of the war. President Polk said that they had invaded our territory and shed American blood on American soil. A lot of people didn't agree with this because this was a disputed territory that technically was Mexico's. They never acknowledged that there was a new border. So it was kind of, everyone saw that this was a provocation, but a lot of people didn't mind. So we have the war here. Mexico usually outnumbered the United States troops. However, they had several problems. They had an unstable government and a divided nation. They had pretty much an empty treasury, so not much funding for the war. They had, not as advanced military technology, so they were using like bulky fixed cannons, whereas the United States had newer light artillery. And Mexico was fighting two wars at once. So not only war with the United States, but different wars going on with the native population in the Mexican territory. So Whigs were opposed to the war. They saw that it was, a shady attempt to acquire more land for the United States, but even more than that, to extend slavery through the southern half of, North America. The South ran out of room to push slavery into. The only option was to get that southwestern land. So in these battles of the war, the U.S. won almost every battle, but Mexico really was refusing to surrender, even though they were losing quite a bit. And so it wasn't until the United States invaded Mexico at Mexico City, captured it, not until then did Mexico agree to terms of surrender. And so this is where we have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where half of Mexico was given to the United States. The United States paid $15 million to Mexico for that territory and assumed all U.S. claims against Mexico. So any debts that Mexico had to the United States. So it ended up costing the United States about $97 million. The United States lost about 13,000 lives. And another issue is that it brought slavery, the issue of slavery, right to the front of discussion. So that's about it for this week. It's a quick lecture. Really, you guys have a lot of reading to do, and you have an exam, so I don't want to take up much more of your time. And I'll see you next week.